Hi there, this is revision of River and Valleys with Mr. Mercer. Now, in this question, there are features that you can always go for. In other words, there are features that will always be there that you can score marks with. Dealing with the river first, you will always find a confluence, you'll always find a tributary, you'll nearly always find a meander. The river will always be flowing, so you can always talk about the direction of flow. The river will also have width, and you can try and talk about compare the width of the river at different points. When we move to the valley will also always have width, so you can compare its width at various points. The valley will have sides, and you can compare its steepness at various points. And the valley will have shape. Is it wide and U-shaped? Is it narrow and V-shaped? So, let's get started. The first thing I'm going to deal with in this answer is the valley. Why? Because it's slightly trickier than dealing with the river, and because due to that extra bit of difficulty, candidates in the exam often forget to talk about it at all, and if you do that, you'll lose half of the marks for the question. So, here is the river running down its valley. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to find the sides of the valley. Well, if this is the river, then as I move away from the river, I will find the valley sides. These contours show me the sides of the valley, and it's quite clear that the north side of the river valley here is steeper than the south side. I would grid reference those locations and compare the two. The next thing I would do is I would find a point on the river where I can compare the width of the valley. Well, if we look in this location here, the width of the valley is clearly greater than at this location here. Again, I would use a grid reference to compare the two and turn that into a sentence. After that point, I might talk about, for example, a floodplain. Now, if I move the map around a little bit, I can see this very wide area of flat land around the river here. And I would talk about there being a wide, flat floodplain at this grid referenced location. But to really make this an excellent answer, I would say there's a wide, flat floodplain extending north of the river at this grid reference, but only a small area of floodplain extending to the south. And that shows that you're describing the landscape. You're not just listing a set of features. You must avoid that. You don't want to just list features as you find them. You want to connect this together into a nice description of the landscape. So we've talked about valley steepness, valley width, and a floodplain. Moving on to the river. Easy features. There's a confluence right there. Grid reference that for marks. There's a tributary. For example, there's absolutely loads of them, but there's a tributary just here. Again, grid reference that for marks. After that point, the next thing you should try and go for is direction of flow. If you don't know the direction of flow, if you can't work it out, then guess. In this instance, the river is travelling either diagonally this way up the map or diagonally that way down the map. And therefore, you've got a 50-50 chance of guessing it correctly. To work it out, the easiest way is to look at the confluences. These smaller streams, these tributaries, are all joining in a common direction. They're all joining in, and if you imagine them actually flowing and joining onto this larger river, then it only really makes sense that the river is flowing from the northwest towards the southeast. And that would be the direction of flow. After that point, find a meander. Well, in this instance, move the map around a bit. I don't fancy any of these smaller ones. They're not exaggerated enough. But here's a nice exaggerated loop. And so that's a meander bend. Then I could compare that to a smaller meander bend further downstream. Notice how I phrase that sentence. A large meander and then a smaller meander further downstream. Further downstream at this grid reference we find some braiding. And then a very large instance of braiding here. Again, a good comparison. And then down here we find some ponds or flooded land, another excellent feature of river and valleys. There are of course loads of other features you could look for, oxbow lakes and waterfalls and so on. But what you have to be aware of is that they might not be there on the day of the exam. So you have to be adaptable. The key thing to revise are the features that you will always be able to spot. Confluences, tributaries, direction of flow, steepness of valley side, width of valley, and make comparative statements. Talk about the landscape in a descriptive way. Do not list your features. Okay, if you want any further help, come and find me, but I hope that helped as a basic revision.